Following the bomb attack in Manchester, police say their investigation is making progress. It's thought the suspected suicide bomber, 22-year-old Salman Abedi, a native of Manchester, may have been part of a wider network planning further attacks. There have been another 3 arrests in Manchester today. Troops are to be deployed on the streets of major cities after the terror threat level was raised to critical, the highest possible, late last night. And so far, the names of 12 victims of the bombing at the Manchester Arena have been released, but police say they do know the identities of all those who died. And there's been another meeting of the Cabinet's Emergency Committee, COBRA, the third in the past 24 hours.
Good progress with the operation has been made, with a number of arrests overnight, and that will continue. We have now gone to a critical level in terms of the threat.
We'll have all the latest live with you in Manchester. The other headlines this lunchtime: President Trump meets the Pope at the Vatican and receives a signed copy of the Pontiff's view on climate change. And profits at Marks & Spencer fell by almost 2/3 last year following a costly business overhaul.
And coming up in the sport on BBC News, Manchester United fans pay tribute to the victims of Monday night's attack ahead of tonight's Europa League final in Stockholm.
Good afternoon from Albert Square in the heart of Manchester. This is where thousands gathered last night for that vigil to remember the victims of Monday night's bomb attack at the Manchester Arena. And people have been coming here all morning to leave messages. Let me show you some of the tributes that have been left during the day. Lots of messages of solidarity, sympathy obviously with the victims and their families, and lots of the messages simply bearing one strong message, which is I love Manchester. It's really a demonstration of affection and sympathy, if you like, which has been the focal point here at Manchester Town Hall. Crowds of people joining people in the square today. 22 people were killed, including teenagers and children, when a suicide bomber detonated a device at the end of that pop concert. Dozens were injured. The terror threat level was raised last night to critical, which, as we know, is the highest level. So far, the names of 12 of the victims have been released, but police say they do know the identities of all the victims. The suspected bomber has been identified as 22-year-old Salman Abedi, who was born here in Manchester to a family of Libyan origin. The focus of the investigation is whether he was part of a wider network planning further attacks. That is the suggestion that the Home Secretary made earlier today, and indeed the suggestion made by the Prime Minister last night in that statement in Downing Street. There have been 3 arrests in Manchester this morning. Another arrest was made yesterday. We start with this first report by our correspondent Richard Galpin.
Of those killed in the attack on Monday night, more have now been named, including Olivia Campbell, who was 15 years old. Her family had been desperately searching for her, hoping she was still alive. Amongst the other victims was Kelly Brewster from Sheffield, whose partner said he and their daughter, like everyone, were absolutely devastated. And Martin Hett, a PR manager, whose friends described him as wonderful, iconic and beautiful. Much more is also now known of the person who detonated the powerful bomb filled with metal nuts and bolts at the Manchester Arena, killing and maiming so many people. He was 22-year-old Salman Abedi, born and brought up in Manchester of Libyan parents. He was known to the security services. A former classmate has described him as gullible and short-tempered, and that he'd become increasingly religious at school. There are now reports he'd travelled to countries where Islamist extremists are based. The French Interior Minister Gérard Collomb said he'd been told by investigators here in Britain that Abedi had gone to Libya and then, without doubt, to Syria. He said he'd been radicalised and decided to commit this attack. Yesterday, heavily armed police carried out raids in South Manchester, arresting his brother, Ismail. And there have been more raids today, with another 3 men arrested in the city. With the authorities increasingly concerned Abedi was part of a network of extremists, the terrorist threat level has been raised to critical, the highest possible. It means armed police can now be backed up by thousands of troops across the country.
This was a horrific, violent event. It was more sophisticated than some of the horrific events that we've seen in the past or in other parts of Europe. So people are reasonably wondering whether he did this on his own.
Buckingham Palace is one of the key locations where troops will be positioned instead of police. And today, the usual ceremony around the changing of the guard was cancelled. And there's been particularly high security at St Paul's Cathedral in London for a visit by the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh.
There's so many big events across the country over the next couple of weeks. We're going to be working really closely with the organisers to review the security, review their stewarding arrangements, review our policing arrangements, and make sure decisions are taken that events only go ahead when it's sensible and safe to do so.
In Manchester, while people continue to grieve, there is also determination to remain united as a community.
We were numb yesterday with shock, and today I guess we're waking up to the enormity of what has happened, but I think people did take enormous comfort from what happened yesterday. It was our darkest hour, but also you saw the best of Greater Manchester yesterday. I was in the hospitals late last night, and I was hearing stories that porters, cleaners, surgeons, nurses came in from not being on shift to help out. The public were bringing in food, and people really did pull together, and I think we should take a great deal of pride in that at our most testing moment that Greater Manchester came together.
That sense of community spirit is vital, but it'll still take time for the city to recover from the trauma of what happened here on Monday night. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, more information has been emerging about the suspected bomber, Salman Abedi, who was 22. He was born here in Manchester. His parents were refugees from Libya. They were refugees from the Gaddafi regime. He was at one point a student at Salford University, and it's reported that he recently travelled to Libya. He returned to the UK just a few days before the attack happened. And French officials have been saying today that it is likely that he's travelled to Syria in recent months. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner has the latest details on that.
The face of Salman Abedi, identified as the Manchester suicide bomber. He's now thought to have had help, quite possibly from an expert bomb maker. This amateur footage taken yesterday is believed to show his brother Ismail being arrested in Manchester. At the Abedi family home nearby, police used explosives to gain access and then search for clues. But there are international connections to this plot. From Manchester, Abedi is believed to have recently gone to Libya, a failed state. And today the French Interior Minister said that war-torn Syria was also a country he'd probably spent time in. Increasingly, investigators have been coming around to the conclusion that the bomber, Salman Abedi, was not working alone, that he was simply the mule carrying a device that was designed and built for him by somebody else. That bomb maker would still be at large, which is why the UK terror threat level has been raised to critical. MI5, the security service, is working with the police and other intelligence agencies to try and trace every possible connection Abedi had, both in this country and abroad. This is what we know about Salman Abedi. He was born in Manchester in 1994, of Libyan parents from Tripoli. He dropped out of Salford University, and he was already known to the security services.
In fact, the individual I spoke to yesterday, who is a very close friend of the family, described him as really a very naive individual. And that really suggests to me that he would not have been able to put the explosive belt and to build it on his own. He must have had some support, helping him doing that.
Meanwhile, the search for clues continues. They're forensic, they're digital, and they are testimonies from both witnesses and suspects. This, say the police, is a fast-moving, wide-ranging investigation. Frank Gardner, BBC News.
Well, as Frank was saying there, a wide-ranging investigation, but there is an important Libyan context to this very clearly. So let's go live to Libya now and talk to our correspondent there, Quentin Somerville. And Quentin, what have you been able to piece together about the family background there in Libya?
Well, Hugh, we believe that Salman Abedi's father may actually be in Libya presently, and that this is a family which has links to radical Islamist groups, that has expressed support for Al-Qaeda, but not just for Al-Qaeda, but also for Al-Qaeda, the Nusra Front in Syria. It's worth remembering, Hugh, that Libya, it's much forgotten about in the war against the so-called Islamic State, but it really has become the southern compass point of their caliphate. And thousands of fighters from Libya who'd honed their skills battling against President Gaddafi then moved both to Syria and to Iraq and honed those skills further. They were then able to come back here and set up a base here, and of course they can then move from Libya to Europe. We don't know if Salman Abedi was part of that network, but his family certainly have links and have expressed support for those radical Islamist groups.
Quentin, thanks very much. Quentin Somerville there with the latest on the story that he's been able to piece together in Libya. It's known that 22 people were killed in the attack. The identities of 12 have now been revealed. They include 32-year-old Kelly Brewster from Sheffield, 15-year-old Olivia Campbell from Bury. They were named this morning. Tributes have been paid, of course, to all the victims, not just at these floral tributes here in Albert Square, but tributes being paid across the country, including to 8-year-old Safi Roussos, who was described by her head teacher as simply a beautiful little girl in every aspect of the word. Our correspondent Judith Moritz has this report.
Little Safi Roussos had gone with her mum to dance to her pop idol. She became the youngest known victim of the Arena attack. The 8-year-old's death has hit her community hard, parents holding their children close, and the mound of flowers and tributes at her family's fish and chip shop continuing to grow. Safi was a pupil at a village primary school in Lancashire. Her loss has affected parents, pupils and staff who held a minute's silence for her this morning.
Safi was simply a beautiful little girl in every aspect of the word. She was loved by everyone, and her warmth and kindness will be remembered fondly. Safi was quiet and unassuming with a creative flair. Safi comes from a close, loving family, and we can only imagine what they're going through.
The names of those killed keep emerging. The identities of half of the 22 concert-goers who died are now known publicly. Amongst them, teenagers who'd gone to the gig and at least 4 parents who'd gone to collect their children at the end of the show. Greater Manchester Police say they're now confident they've been able to identify all of those killed, that their families have been contacted and that they're being supported by specially trained officers. Yesterday, the mother of teenager Olivia Campbell was searching for her daughter. Today came confirmation that the 15-year-old is amongst those who died, her mum paying tribute to her on Facebook. 59 people were injured in the attack. Hospitals across Manchester are continuing to treat many of them.
There have been the sort of traumatic injuries that you would expect in terms of the type of device that was used, the proximity to the people who were injured, and so we're dealing with injuries to major organs. We're dealing with sort of loss of limbs potentially. We're dealing with embedded objects, all the horrific injuries that you would expect from the event that happened.
20 years ago, this church was damaged in the IRA bomb attack. Today, it's just one spot in this city which provides a focal point for grief and a place where strength and solidarity are on show too. Judith Moritz, BBC News, Manchester.
Well, I mentioned that the Cabinet's Emergency Committee, known as COBRA, met this morning, and that was for the 3rd time in 24 hours. We'll have the latest on that in a moment with our Assistant Political Editor, Norman Smith. But first, let's talk about those who are being treated for injuries in several of the hospitals in the Greater Manchester area. Let's go to Manchester Royal Infirmary, and Fiona Trott is there. What's the latest you have there, Fiona?
The development here, Hugh, is that we now know 64 people have been injured. 20 of them are in a critical condition in hospital. 9 patients are being treated here at Manchester Royal Infirmary. Others are at 7 other hospitals in Greater Manchester. Of course, what we already know as well is that 12 of the casualties are under 16 years of age. They're at the Children's Hospital next door. And 2 days on from the attack, we're learning more about the staff who are treating them as well. Staff who just turned up for work because they wanted to help. The trust was so overwhelmed, it sent them home, apparently, because they were worried about covering the rota for the rest of the week. Staff have been coming in, bringing in food for their colleagues. There have been people here from other trusts in other parts of the UK who happen to be in Manchester who have also offered to help. The British Red Cross has been playing its part too. It has been using its own ambulances to take patients to and from hospital. And it has set up a fund with Manchester City Council to support families because, as one NHS executive said here today, earlier on today, for many patients, this is the start of a very long road. They will need assistance for some time yet. And it's not just physical injuries, of course, it's mental trauma too. One of the neighbouring trusts, Pennine Care, has put information on its website about how people can spot the signs, and it's published contacts for charities and organisations who can help. Hugh.
Fiona, thanks very much. Fiona Trott there for us at Manchester Royal Infirmary. So the latest then on the Emergency Cabinet Committee meeting, COBRA, met this morning at Westminster. Let's go to Downing Street. Norman Smith is there. Norman, what's the latest you have for us on the COBRA meeting?
Well, Hugh, I think we get a sense of just how seriously the security services and indeed ministers view the terror threat we face, with the Home Secretary this morning confirming that she does not believe Salman Abedi was acting on his own, that he had accomplices, associates, may have been part of some broader terror network. Secondly, the decision to deploy really very considerable numbers of troops, up to 4,000 troops to be made available to buttress the police at key installations. And this morning we actually saw paratroopers, so key elite troops, arriving at Westminster, and you can see they are armed, these paratroopers at Westminster. And they, I presume, will be replacing the police officers who normally guard Westminster, releasing them to take part in the security operation. Now, that is important symbolically too, because we almost never see troops deployed in mainland Britain, only in very rare circumstances, but I think that underlines the scale of the threat ministers believe we face. One other area of controversy, Hugh, this morning, with UKIP signalling that they plan to resume their election campaign tomorrow with the launch of their manifesto. They say not to do so would in effect be a defeat for democracy. I have to say I think that decision will prove hugely controversial. There is no sign any other party is going to follow suit. Indeed, the language from within government suggests there may be several more days before the election actually resumes, because I think there is a view it would just be inappropriate to have politicians shouting the odds at each other when you have youngsters, children in hospital fighting for their life. More than that, you also have an ongoing live security operation and potentially a threat to people from that terrorism.
Norman, again, thanks very much. Norman Smith there with the latest for us on the COBRA meeting and what's been said there in Downing Street. Well, earlier today, as more information emerged about the suspect, Salman Abedi, the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, as Norman was suggesting there, revealing that he'd been known to the security services up to a point. That was the phrase used. Let's talk to our Home Affairs correspondent, Daniel Sanford. Daniel, can you tell us more about the Home Secretary's phrase up to a point, and what is the context around that?
Well, the point is that Salman Abedi had at some point come across the radar of the security services. He had been reported to them. We know of at least 2 occasions when he was reported to them. But that happens a lot, and it doesn't necessarily mean that any investigation into that turns into a long-term investigation. So although he was known, what they really need to know now is what his movements were in recent weeks and months. We certainly know that at some point he was in Libya. There are now these suggestions from the French Interior Minister that he may have gone to Syria. There are other suggestions that he may at some point have travelled to Germany, and that is absolutely vital, of course, in terms of piecing together what happened in the days building up to the attack itself. The other absolutely central part of this operation is trying to find the place where the bomb was made, because until you find the place where the bomb was made, you don't know if there are other bombs and other bombers, and that's at the heart of the police operation at the moment, and of course at the heart of the reason that the threat level has been raised to critical. There was the arrest of Abidi's brother yesterday. 3 more people were arrested this morning, but that seems to have been quite a low-profile raid. No suggestion that that was the bomb factory. Much more high-profile is a raid going on right now in Manchester city centre on Granby Row, an operation involving uniformed armed officers, ununiformed officers who look more like they were military, fire engines, the closure of a railway line. But it doesn't seem there either, as if there's been suddenly a safety cordon put in place, so I'm not sure that that's the bomb factory either.
Daniel, many thanks. If we have more on that, we'll be back to it straight away. Daniel Sanford there, our Home Affairs correspondent. There'll be more from Manchester a little later in the programme, but for now, let's catch up with some of the day's other news, and let's join Simon.
Hugh, thank you. 1:20, and that is our top story this lunchtime. The terror threat is raised to critical after it's thought the suspected Manchester suicide bomber may have been part of a wider network. Still to come, President Trump's first visit to Europe since taking office begins with a visit to the Vatican.
Coming up in sport at past, Arsene Wenger says Arsenal haven't requested any extra security ahead of this Saturday's FA Cup final at Wembley, where a security review is currently underway.
It's perhaps difficult to think of 2 more different people, and today President Donald Trump met Pope Francis at the Vatican for a short private audience on the 3rd leg of his overseas trip. The 2 men have already clashed at a distance on issues including migration and climate change. James Reynolds reports from Rome, and a warning: his report contains flash photography.
No one rushes to meet the Pope. President Trump was escorted slowly through the Vatican corridors and into the Pope's office. This was the first time these 2 leaders, opposites in almost every way, have met. Such an honor, the president said. The Pope rarely smiles during this kind of photo call. He appeared eager to begin their conversation. The president, who wants to build a border wall, sat across from the Pope, who says that he wants to build bridges. After half an hour of private talks, Francis met the president's delegation. "Do you feed him Slovenian cakes?" the Pope joked to Mrs. Trump. She and the president's daughter followed Vatican tradition and wore black veils. The 2 leaders then exchanged gifts. The Pope gave the president some of his writings, including his appeal for environmental protection. "Well, I'll be reading them," the president said politely.
Thank you very much.
Francis will hope so. It's hard to imagine a meeting between 2 more contrasting leaders. The Pope, who's already on to his next audience, opposes the president on immigration, climate change and border walls. Their first short meeting was a chance for each man to test whether or not the other would give ground. The president and his wife were left to visit the Sistine Chapel, painted by Michelangelo. The leader, with his own noted taste in expensive decor, looked impressed. James Reynolds, BBC News, Rome.
Here, the high street retailer Marks & Spencer has seen its profits plummet by 64% to £176 million in the last year. The chief executive, Steve Rowe, blamed the cost of overhauling the business, a decline in clothing sales and the costs of opening new food stores. Our business correspondent Emma Simpson reports.
No excuses, no staying silent, no holding back.
It's the latest M&S campaign. And the new boss isn't holding back either with his programme of change, but it's come at a cost. International stores like this one are closing, so too are some UK shops. The final salary pension scheme's going. Just some of the things that have put a big dent in profits.
We want to create a business that's fit for the future, that's got foundations for growth. We've got to get the estate right for a multi-channel customer. Our customers are more and more digitally savvy and they want to shop in a different way, and that means we need less stores but we need fewer, bigger stores with better experiences for customers in the UK.
The new boss is also trying to wean M&S off promotions and discounts, trying to get us to buy more stuff at full price. Although clothing sales turned positive at Christmas, they fell back again in the last few months. So, is this new strategy working?
They've done really well to cut back on the number of sales and retrain shoppers to actually pay full price for items. So that certainly helped in the short term. But I think longer term, the core issue for M&S is that its clothing sales have been more or less in decline for the past half a decade, and they're really stuck in the middle. They're playing that dangerous middle ground where they're not the cheapest, they're not the most fashionable.
These are two garments that were recent.
The M&S boss knows he needs to get clothing right. Trouble is, we don't want to spend as much on them as we once did.
They're spending their money quite slightly differently. They're spending more on experiences, on leisure activities, on holidays. Spending intentions to buy more coffee are up by 7%. But what that does mean is in areas like clothing, spending intentions are reduced. And for the first time in many years, the clothing market fell by nearly 2%. What we've got to do is make sure that within that environment, we're doing the right things for our customer.
Sounds easy, but turning round women's fashion so crucial to profits is going to take time in a market that's getting even tougher. Emma Simpson, BBC News.
Now let's go back to Manchester and Hugh.
Simon, thanks. Yes, welcome back to Albert Square in the heart of Manchester. This really is the focal point, if you like, of people's expressions of sympathy and solidarity. This is where people are coming to lay their floral tributes, leaving messages of sympathy with families, the families of the victims, or simply declaring their affection for the city of Manchester. That's one of the strongest messages that's coming out. So many of the victims of Monday's attack were young people and children. There were thousands at that concert featuring the American star Ariana Grande. And parents and teachers have been faced with the challenge of discussing what happened with children. Our correspondent Ricky Boletto has spent some time in a class in Manchester to see how they've been confronting what happened on Monday.
Right, morning everyone. Has everybody heard the news? Yeah. Have you all heard what's happened?
It's the start of the school day.
There's been an attack in Manchester.
And for these primary school children in South Manchester, there's a change to normal lessons.
Because there's more security and you can just feel more safer than what happened yesterday.
These 11-year-old pupils have been given the chance to talk about what happened at the Manchester Arena.
All over the UK, teachers are trying to explain to their students what happened on Monday night, and many schools here in Manchester have been offered extra counselling to help children over the next few days.
I would say to parents and caregivers, just be there. Try to keep their routine as normal as possible and listen. If they want to ask the same question over and over again, that's absolutely fine. Just answer it, just be there and try to keep them calm.
Many children here have spent the day sharing their worries.
Well, I was quite scared because, like, in case it would actually happen closer, even more closer to us.
Well, I always speak to an adult about any worries that I have, mainly my mum. But if, like, maybe she's not available or it's late at night and I don't want to wake her up or something, I have a teddy that always sits at the end of my bed, and it's a worry teddy. So I just open it, write my worry on a piece of paper and put it in, and then close the zip, and it feels like it's eating it up a bit, and it makes me feel a lot better.
I reassured myself by talking to my dad in the morning, and he said it'll be all right, and police officers are investigating on it, and everyone's very helpful.
I mean, how do you feel about what you've heard and what you've seen this morning?
For teachers, sharing this kind of news is never easy, but at this school they say it's important to reassure the children as much as they can.
The fact that there were children involved, it made it even more difficult for the children to understand, and it made it even more important for us to talk about it as soon as they came in, to reassure them and to help them feel safe, because, you know, they were worried about it. You know, and a lot of them go to the M&S Arena, lots of them go to concerts there. You know, it's somewhere that they would go, so it becomes really real for them.
Manchester's famous for its music, and last night the show went on as Simple Minds played at the Bridgewater Hall. Anthony took his 9-year-old son Lewis to his first live gig experience.
It does make you think about it a lot, bringing a young child as well, but we had a chat about it and he decided he'd still like to go ahead with it and come along.
For many children, Monday's attack will be the talking point in the playground. But at times like this, it's children who show us all how resilient they can be. Ricky Belletto, BBC News.
Another aspect of the day is that thousands of football fans from Manchester are in Stockholm today for the Europa League final between Manchester United and... Another aspect of the day is that thousands of football fans from Manchester are in Stockholm today for the Europa League final between Manchester United and Ajax tonight. A minute's silence will be observed just before kick-off. The team's executive vice-chairman Ed Woodward said that everyone at the club felt numb at this week's events, and their thoughts obviously were with the victims of the attack. Our sports correspondent Andy Swiss is in Stockholm, has been speaking to some of the fans who've travelled there.
Under Stockholm sunshine, United fans gathered for the normal big final build-up. But this is now no normal final. While the supporters are here in Sweden, their thoughts are back in Manchester, a club and a city united.
We keep getting messages from back home about people we know who were there, some of the people who've died. It's been quite sombre, to say the least, but equally we can't let them beat them. You know, they can't beat us. We're not going to let them beat us.
It's for Manchester, and it's for the you know, all the people involved, the